What would you do if God promised you something that seemed impossible? Imagine being in Abraham's shoes, receiving a promise from God about a future that seems far out of reach. Abraham, originally named Abram, is often called the father of faith. His story is one of the most significant in the Bible because it demonstrates what it means to have complete trust in God, even when the circumstances seem impossible. His journey of faith is not just about his belief in God, but also about his obedience, willingness to sacrifice, and the promises he received from God. Abraham's story begins in the land of Ur, where he lived with his family. One day, God called Abraham to leave his home, his family, and everything he knew to go to a land that God would show him. The interesting thing here is that Abraham didn't know where he was going. God didn't give him all the details up front. He simply said, "Go to the land that I will show you." Think about it. Leaving your comfort zone, your family, and everything familiar without knowing exactly what lies ahead. That's a huge leap of faith. But Abraham obeyed. He trusted God enough to leave behind everything and set out on an unknown journey. After Abraham left his home, God made a promise to him. He said that Abraham would become the father of a great nation, even though at that time, Abraham didn't have any children. Imagine receiving a promise like that when you're already old and you don't have a son. It seemed impossible, but Abraham believed God's word. God told Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. He promised Abraham that his faith would be rewarded and that through him, the world would be blessed. These promises were part of God's covenant with Abraham. Years passed, and still, Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children. Sarah began to doubt that God would fulfill his promise, and one day, as Abraham was sitting outside his tent, 3 visitors arrived. These were no ordinary visitors. They were angels sent by God. One of them spoke to Abraham and told him that Sarah would have a son by this time next year. Now, Sarah was listening from inside the tent, and when she heard this, she laughed to herself. She thought it was impossible. She was far too old to have a child. But the angel rebuked her, saying, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" This was a turning point in Sarah's faith, as she realized that God was capable of doing the impossible, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Despite her doubts, Sarah eventually conceived and gave birth to Isaac, the child of promise. Abraham's faith was proven true, and God's timing was perfect. The ultimate test of Abraham's faith came when God asked him to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac. This command must have been heart-wrenching. Abraham had waited for years for the promise of a son, and now God was asking him to give up his only son, the one through whom God's promises would be fulfilled. But Abraham's faith never wavered. He obeyed God without hesitation. He took Isaac up to the mountain, prepared the altar, and was ready to sacrifice his son. Just as he was about to strike, God stopped him and provided a ram for the sacrifice. God was not interested in the death of Isaac. He was testing Abraham's faith and obedience. Through this test, God confirmed that Abraham's faith was genuine. Because of Abraham's obedience and faith, God made a lasting covenant with him. He promised to make Abraham the father of many nations, and from his descendants would come great blessings. Through Abraham's lineage, God's plan of salvation for the world would unfold, ultimately leading to the birth of Jesus Christ. God's covenant with Abraham was unconditional. It wasn't based on Abraham's performance, but on God's grace and promise. His story teaches us about trusting God's promises, even when things look impossible. What does Abraham's story teach you about trusting God's timing? Do you find it easy or hard to have faith in God's promises? Drop your answers in the comments section. Like, share, and subscribe for more inspirational content like this, and follow us for more updates.